Hey everybody, this is Caleb with On the Wrong Lead. Today we're going to take a look at one of the four building blocks of handicapping, class. Now, you may have heard a few of my On the Wrong Lead cohorts say that class doesn't matter, but if you know them at all, then you know that you really shouldn't be taking advice about class from people like that. So, let's jump into it. Class. What does it mean? What is class? So, to put it simply, class just refers to the level of competition that a horse has been racing against. To give a sports analogy, it's the difference between being a college football player in Division III versus Division II versus Division I, or even versus the NFL. Yes, all of those are football players, but there's a different caliber and different level of competition and quality of talent as a D3 athlete versus a D1 athlete versus a professional athlete. So, horse racing has its own levels of class. And I broke them down into 6 basic buckets here. You could continue to slice and dice these even more, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to leave it just at these 6. So, going from the highest class, or the best racing, to the lowest class, you have graded stakes, non-graded stakes, allowance races, claiming races, maiden special weight races, and then maiden claiming races. So, if a horse is going from a weaker race to a stronger race, it's generally said to be moving up in class. And on the other hand, if it's going from a stronger race to a weaker race, it's said to be dropping in class. A horse going from a graded stakes to an allowance race is dropping in class, where a horse going from a claiming race to an allowance race is going up in class. So we're going to talk about all of these in a little more detail, and we're going to start in the basement, the worst of the worst, maiden claimers. So maiden claiming races are simply races that are limited to horses who have never won a race. That's what the maiden part means, is these horses have never won. It doesn't matter if it's their first career start or if it's their 50th career start. Maiden races are limited to horses who have never won. Now, the claiming part of maiden claiming indicates that the horses that are entered in these races are eligible to be claimed. So, if you don't understand what that means, basically, if you enter your horse in a maiden claiming race, then you have to put him for sale, essentially, at a predetermined price. Based on this example here, it's $20,000. And anybody can put in a claim slip before that race to make an attempt to purchase your horse. If there's multiple claim slips, they have to go to a random draw, basically, to decide who gets it. But horses in maiden claiming races can be claimed and bought by anyone who has a license. So these are the worst of the worst, as we said, and they can actually carry additional restrictions beyond the fact that horses have never won a race before, such as state-bred restrictions where they had to have been bred in a specific state like California, or that they have to have been sold for a less than a certain price at auction, age restrictions, things like that. When evaluating maiden claiming races, typically the higher the claiming price tag, the better the race. As you move down into the basement, into the maiden 20,000s, 10,000s, and even less at some tracks, the races really deteriorate pretty quickly. These are some of the harder races to handicap because these horses are unpredictable, they're inconsistent, they don't have a lot of good form to judge them off of. So they are challenging races. If you look at the form, a maiden claiming race would be denoted with an MC and then the claiming price tag after it here. You would also see an example in the past performances of this horse, Moravino. You can see in the race type here, he's been running in maiden claiming races. Started off in maiden claiming 62,000 and then dropped to 40,000 and then dropped all the way down to 20,000 for his last 3, which is where he's at today. A step above maiden claiming races are maiden special weight. So once again, the maiden word here indicates that the horses in this race have never won a race before. However, the main difference between maiden claiming races and maiden special weight races are that maiden special weight races, none of the horses in the race are eligible to be claimed. So you can't buy anyone's horse out of that race or claim anyone's horse out of that race. These are the races where 99% of your promising first-time starter horses are going to debut. All of your high-profile Todd Pletcher and Chad Brown and Bob Baffert horses are going to debut in a maiden special weight race. Similar to Maiden Claiming, they can carry additional restrictions, such as state bred or a number of other things. But unlike Maiden Special Weight, the claiming price tag of the Maiden Claiming races, higher being better, doesn't necessarily apply for Maiden Special Weight races. A higher purse doesn't inherently mean that it's a stronger Maiden Special Weight race. So for this example, at Santa Anita, the purse was $57,000 for the Maiden Special Weight. That's not to say that it's necessarily a worse race than this $63,000 Maiden Special Weight race that was held at Belmont. And there is some subjectivity to it. It is probably more important to understand the relative class of the track in question rather than the actual purse, because there is a lot of nuance there. Again, Maiden Special Weight would often be noted by this MDN abbreviation followed by the purse, and you can see it down here in the past performances, noted as an MDN, or I think some forms might show it as an MSW. Next, we'll talk about claiming races. So claiming races are really the bread and butter of the horse racing industry. It's where most horses will end up for most of their career. So in claiming races, as we already touched on earlier, every horse is eligible to be claimed or purchased for a predetermined price. So claiming races are generally weaker than allowance races, which we'll get to next, but also stronger than maiden races. So when you're talking about claiming races, there's a huge disparity between the bottom of the barrel, cheap $10,000 claimers or the mid to upper tier, $50,000 claiming races as well. So there's a big gap there in terms of the disparity. Claiming price tag is generally a reliable indicator for determining how strong a race is. So if the claiming price tag is higher, the race is probably stronger. If it's a pretty cheap claiming race, then the race probably isn't that strong. That isn't universally true, but it's a good rule of thumb to go by. Now, claiming races and allowance races, as we'll get to next, can have a lot of restrictions. You can have open claiming races where as long as you enter for the price tag to be claimed, you can enter the race. But you may also see something like this here, where it's a $10,000 claiming race, and you'll see this N3L abbreviation. What that means is you can read in the conditions, it's a $10,000 claiming race for fillies and mares 3 years old and upward, which have never won 3 races. That's what this N3L indicates. It's a non-winners of 3 lifetime. So that's one example of a restricted claiming race. There are countless examples. You can have non-winners of 2 lifetime, you can have state-bred claiming, you can have claiming races that are limited to specific age groups, you can have claiming races for horses who haven't won a race in the past year, haven't won so much money in the past year. There's a lot of different kind of conditions that the racing secretary can write to try to fill fields and make big fields and competitive fields. So you'll see some of the examples here of what a claiming race would look like in the past form. It's abbreviated with the CLM. If there are any conditions, it would be noted after the claiming price tag. You would see this N3L or N2X or whatever else. Next, we have allowance races. So allowance races are essentially any event that is a non-claiming event for horses who have won a race before, but they're not stakes races. So in general, they're stronger races than claiming races, but they're weaker than any of your stakes racing. Allowance races are generally for horses that have shown promise and that their owners and their connections don't want to lose this horse to another trainer by entering them in a claiming race. So they put them in an allowance race where they can compete for some pretty nice purse money and don't risk losing the horse. So, and again, allowance racing, no horse is eligible to be claimed. Just like claiming races and everything else, there are conditions that you have to meet with allowance racing. There's almost always conditions with allowance races. Very rarely will you just see an open, non-claiming allowance race without a condition. So you may see something like this right here, which is an allowance race with a purse of $105,000, and it's an N1X. That's probably the most common annotation for allowance racing is N something X, N1X, N2X, N3X. Basically what that means is that a horse has to, in order to be eligible to run in that race, a horse has to have never won one race other than something. That's what the X means. It's something. In general, if you're winning maiden races, if you're winning claiming races, it's not going to preclude you from running in allowance races. Those usually don't count against you. The X usually means you've never won a race other than maiden or maiden claiming. Sometimes they'll add some other conditions, such as state-bred restricted races, or sometimes starter allowance races, which we can touch on later. But generally, what this says is you can't have won an allowance race and still compete in this N1X allowance race. It's kind of tough to quantify allowance races, but on the whole, the more restrictive they are, the easier they are. And as the restrictions ease up, the races get harder. An N1X allowance is typically going to be easier than an N2X allowance, which will typically be easier than an N3X. So, the one other thing to note on is that there are a type of races called optional claiming, and these races are essentially just allowance races that allow horses to run that don't meet the conditions as long as they go in for a claiming price tag. Those would be indicated by this OC number. So basically what this OC 40,000 N2X is saying is that you can run in this race and not be eligible to be claimed as long as you meet these N2X criteria, generally meaning you haven't won two races that are better than claiming races. However, if you have won two races better than claiming races, you can still enter in these races. However, your horse has to be eligible for the predetermined price tag, in which case this would be $40,000. So it's a way for horses who have already cleared their allowance conditions but aren't really good enough to run in graded stakes to still have a good place to run. They just have to be entered in for a price tag, and it's usually a fairly high price tag in the $40,000 to $60,000 range. You can see an example down here of what some optional claiming races and allowance races look like, as well as the associated conditions. N3L, N2X, we've kind of covered that already. Next, we'll talk about non-graded stakes races. So non-graded stakes can sometimes be called listed stakes or overnight stakes. On the whole, they're stronger than allowance races, but they're weaker than graded stakes races. Just like we've been saying, there can be restrictions on these non-graded stakes races, such as state-bred stakes limited to fillies and mares, limited to 2-year-olds only. There's a variety of restrictions that apply pretty much across the board. So here's an example of a non-graded stakes race. This was from Breeders' Cup Weekend, I think. So this will look like on the past performances, you'll see the abbreviated name of the stakes. And I actually have no idea what the stakes is. And then you'll see the purse followed by it. It won't say allowance. It won't say OC. It won't have a G1, G2, or G3 annotation. It'll just have an abbreviated stakes name followed by a purse. All these yellow races I've highlighted in the form are examples of non-graded stakes. If you note the green highlighted item down here, that dash G2 at the end indicates it's a graded stakes. It's actually a grade 2 stakes indicated by the G2 at the end. So as long as you don't see dash G2, dash G1, or dash G3, then you'll know that this is a non-graded stakes, which is a pretty nice race. Next, we'll move into graded stakes. These are typically the best races in America, and all of horse racing, really. There are 3 kinds of graded stakes. There's grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3. So grade 1 races, these are your best races in America. Think Kentucky Derby, think the Breeders' Cup Classic, the really high-profile races, generally for the best horses in the country. Next, you have grade 2 races, also very, very prestigious races. And then you'll have grade 3. So what these will look like in your past performances is, an example here is the Breeders' Cup Classic. It's a grade 1 race, annotated by this G1 after the name. And it shows up the same way in the past performances. After the name of the stakes, you'll see G2 down here for the grade 2 stakes, and then a G1 annotated for the grade 1 stakes. I will probably say that the gap between grade 1 and grade 2 isn't quite as large as the gap from grade 2 to grade 3. There's a lot of grade 3 stakes, and a grade 3 horse is a nice horse, but your grade 1 and grade 2 horses are your very nice horses. So there is probably a bigger gap between grade 2 and 3 compared to grade 1 and 2. So we've been going for about 15 minutes, and we now have a basic idea of what class is. So why does class matter? Well, it's important to understand what class level a horse can be competitive at. So if we look at this bottom example here, there's a very famous horse named Mr. Buff who is notorious for being a monster horse in restricted stakes races and non-graded stakes races, but is unable to replicate that form when he moves up to graded stakes company. You'll see all of these races that are not highlighted are listed stakes races, and you'll see he's crushing fields. I mean, win by 7, second, a win by 3, second, win by 20. And he's posting really big speed figures. Most of these are above 100. I mean, it looks like a great horse. But if you look at the races in green, every time this horse moves up in class to face graded stakes company, he runs poorly. 5th by 14, 5th by 15, 5th by 12, with some pretty poor speed figures. It's just the way that the game is sometimes that horses can't always replicate their best efforts when they move up in class. So that is something that we have to be aware of. A lot of the times that's due to the pace. You may be able to run a mile in 8 minutes. However, if you're now forced to run the first half of your mile in 3 minutes, you may tire out and be unable to finish that mile in the same time that you normally would when being able to set your own pace and do your own thing. Pace is more often than not the big culprit of horses who are trying to move up in class, but there are a lot of other factors that can determine, what goes into whether or not a horse can stand a raising class. Another angle to look at is the key race angle. So who has a horse been racing against, and how have those horses done moving on from that race? If they have gone on to win good races and post strong speed figures, then that may have been a good race, and you may want to support a horse moving up in class because that may have been a key race. On the other hand, if horses have exited our last out race and have run poorly in their next start and have not run well at all, then you may want to downgrade that race and think that it wasn't quite as strong as it looked, and you may not want to back the winner of that race in his next start, depending on where he ends up. Lastly, we'll talk about some class considerations. So basically, class, it's true. Some people will tell you that class doesn't matter. And I wouldn't agree with that, but there is some truth to the fact that the advent of speed figures has largely made class handicapping less important. You do need to understand a basic understanding of class and the different levels and how class works. Class can still be really useful for uncovering overlays who maybe were racing against horses that were just too tough for them, or they were just in races that were way over their head, and they look pretty bad if you look at the form. However, they get a drop in class today to a level where they might be competitive or should be competitive or have been competitive in the past. A lot of times you can get nice prices on those horses because they look pretty bad, from their last few races. On the other side, class handicapping can also help you avoid underlays by horses who post huge speed figures in cheap races, but are unable to repeat those efforts in better races. It's tough to know whether or not they can repeat those races until you've seen them move up in class and try it. So let price be your guide in those circumstances. Check out how other horses have done from those races when they've come back to run again. But it can help you avoid some short-priced horses who have ran big speed figures but are probably unable to repeat that when they move up in class. And the last pro of class handicapping is just that you don't need to know the minor details to have a decent understanding of class. You don't need to understand exactly how a non-winners of 3 lifetime claiming race at Laurel stacks up versus a non-winners of 1 allowance race at Pimlico. You don't really need to know that to be able to use class. A basic understanding of the 6 main class levels and how they rank relative to one another is usually enough to add this to your toolbox. As far as cons go, class handicapping can get extremely complex. I just touched on that a little bit, but it can be easy to fall into a rabbit hole a little bit and try to understand if a state-bred allowance race in New York is better than an open claiming race in Florida. There's a lot of nuance, and it can get very tricky. The big con is class handicapping, as far as I'm concerned, is that the quality of a given race can really change from track to track. A $20,000 claiming race at Saratoga is not going to be at the same level as a $20,000 claiming race at Tampa Bay Downs. They're just different. Saratoga has higher quality animals, higher quality jockeys, trainers, and that's going to be a better race than Tampa, even if it's the exact same purse and the exact same conditions. It's just the nature of the beast is tough, and you have to kind of learn what tracks are generally better than others, and that just comes with experience. The last con is just that it is tough to objectively quantify class, because at the end of the day, allowance races may be better than claiming races, but it still is up to the actual field of horses that gets entered as to how strong that particular race is going to be. There are claiming races that end up with fields that are a lot stronger than allowance races, and there's allowance races that end up with fields that are sometimes stronger than graded stakes races. It's not the norm, and they are exceptions, but at the end of the day, it does depend on the exact horses that enter those particular races. That's all I have. I will have a few links in the video description that has a very rough guide to where some of the more detailed races fall in terms of a class hierarchy. So feel free to check that out, as well as a quick glossary of some of the symbols that you might stumble across in the past performances. If you're not familiar with that, I would highly recommend watching one of our videos on how to read the past performances. There's some great stuff in there, but there is a quick glossary I threw together just to highlight what some of the symbols might mean. Thanks for watching, and good luck on the racetrack.